When you go into your Inspector Calls exam, you'll need to think about the following things. Your essay must mention props, lighting, sound effects, stage directions, entrances and exits and their importance, timing, the juxtaposition of the characters on stage, what the characters say, how they interact with each other, including language devices such as euphemism, character progression and tone. Now, if we take the question, look again at the extract in Act 1, beginning at the top of page 3 with Burling's words, "Oh, come, come, I'm treating Gerald like one of the family," and ending near the bottom of page 5 with Mrs. Burling's words, "Well, it came at just the right moment. That was clever of you, Gerald." With reference to the way Priestley presents reactions to the engagement in the extract and relationships elsewhere in the play, show how far you agree that marriage is based on social class. So you'll notice, first of all, that this is the theme question. Unlike the character question, usually, not all the time, but usually the theme question is the one that is accompanied with an extract, a suggestion for the extract. And you have to make sure that when you start writing your essay, that you focus half of your essay on the extract and half of your essay on the rest of the play, okay? So the first thing you should do is obviously read your question, read through the extract, think about props, lighting, sound effects, stage directions, entrances and exits, timing, juxtaposition, and all the things I've listed in the green box, and think about that question as well. And you should also be underlining your question terms or highlighting them, so you know that it's Act 1, the top of page 3, that you need to focus on. You know that it ends on page 5 for that extract, and that it is about how Priestley presents. So we'll underline Priestley presents engagement, reactions, and relationships elsewhere, and marriage based on social class. So you need to be constantly thinking about relationships, marriage, and social class. Okay? And don't forget to actually use that term, Priestley presents, in your own essay writing. So let's have a look at the extract. So if we look at in the extract, first of all, you're going to want to look at the characters of Gerald, Sheila, and then Mr. and Mrs. Burling as well, and the relationships or the dynamic between these people. So first of all, Gerald, he lies to Sheila about his whereabouts the previous summer. He says things like, "I was awfully busy at the works all that time." And she seems quite dubious about whether or not this is really true. So you're going to want to point out things like that. You can also kind of see that because of his class, the fact that he is slightly higher up the social scale than Mr. and Mrs. Burling and his fiancée Sheila, that he feels like this gives him a sense of entitlement that helps him get away with this. He wants Sheila to believe that he has wanted to be a member of her family for a long time, but he also objectifies her and appears to regard her as some sort of well-won prize. And if you also kind of think about the fact that he has this self-satisfied confidence, almost a cockiness when he says things like, "You can drink to me," and this humility as well, "I hope I can make you as happy as you deserve to be." So even though he is slightly higher up the social scale, this kind of makes you wonder, is it really all about class? Because technically he would be marrying beneath him. Then he turns a private moment of giving Sheila an engagement ring into a public event by doing it in front of her family, and you kind of have to question that, and if it's all a big show, and to impress all of them. He does, however, show consideration for Sheila in buying the ring she had admired as well. But he does not respond to Sheila's kiss of thanks and says nothing more to her before she exits. You could argue that he behaves appropriately in order to please Sheila and impress Mr. and Mrs. Burling. That while some candidates may argue Gerald has manipulated the occasion to make himself look good, so you can actually look at both of those arguments. Then if we look at Sheila, she appears to be unhappy with Gerald's disappearance the previous summer, and she makes it known to him as well that she's not going to be one of those girls who will sit around and wait for her husband, as her mother had done. She appears to be very uncertain or unsure of his motives, and she's very suspicious of the fact that he's disappeared. but she's genuinely pleased with her engagement ring and appears to be in love with Gerald. Then if we look at Mr. and Mrs. Burling in the extract, we can see that Mr. Burling definitely, his motives for having his daughter marry Gerald are because of the Burling and Croft businesses. He wants to ensure that he advances socially as a result of his daughter's marriage. So he sees her as just like a pawn in his game of climbing the social ladder and uniting Burling and Croft businesses. He seems a lot more concerned about getting these businesses to work together rather than whether Gerald really loves his daughter. And you might want to compare that to at the very end. And when we find out about Gerald's affair with Eva or Daisy as well, that he defends Gerald because he wants to protect this marriage so much, even risking his daughter's happiness to do so. You might also want to argue that his interest in his daughter's marriage is because he sees it as a way to climb the social ladder. Mrs. Burling tells Sheila that she must get used to her husband being absent or in business, indicating that the marriage to her is a business arrangement or a business transaction. So you can see that the older generation view this as something quite cold, and that for them at least it is about class. We also find out in the exposition as well that Mrs. Burling herself is more socially superior than her husband. So for her, she's obviously very pleased with the fact that Gerald is a member of the aristocracy. He's upper class as opposed to the middle class Burlings. She also acknowledges Gerald's adroitness. That was clever of you, Gerald, indicating her awareness of Gerald's actions, that flattering Sheila and the public engagement are all part of a social ritual that must be followed. It's not about actually loving her. So that's quite interesting to note as well. Then you'll want to comment on the use of language and dramatic techniques. You might want to point out that there's light-hearted conversation, there's a sense of occasion, that at this point the lighting is intimate and rosy versus when the inspector enters later on and unpicks it all and dissects it, where the lighting is much harsher. You might want to emphasise the self-congratulatory giving of the engagement ring and the toasting to suggest that this is a happy scene, pointing out the actual staging and the things that happen as well as the language. That this is undermined then through the inspector's visit and the confessions and revelations, that this happy engagement scene, this self-satisfied scene where they're all very happy and gay, is because he wants to really undermine everything. And you see the lighting change to indicate that he exposes their deep, dark secrets. If you want to point out the use of pompous language and the tone, suggesting the characters appear to be the epitome of good breeding and manners, but then when we actually see their actions later, we realise this is not the case, in fact, far from it. There's this kind of harmonious kind of social event, and unpleasant facts are finessed out of existence through hesitation and ellipses. Priestley uses stage directions to indicate the uncertain nature of Sheila's love, as she is playful with Gerald with mock aggressiveness, and the repetition of half playful, half serious. And the language used by Burling in his toast refers to the business rivalry and the competition between his business and Croft Limited, which again reveals that for him at least, his daughter's marriage, is about class. Gerald's smile could possibly indicate this self-satisfied reminder that a socially successful interaction has happened and that he has pleased his fiancée's parents. Sheila kisses Gerald hastily, indicating that they may not actually know each other very well as well, so that's quite interesting. And everything I've said here so far is taken straight from the SEA mark scheme for this. You will want to develop this further because this mark scheme is just a very basic basis, a starting point of where to actually go on from, okay? And actually looking at past paper questions and the mark schemes is a really good way to revise. So next we're going to look at the rest of the play. Then if we look at other parts of the play, again you're going to want to analyse the two people actually getting married. So you're going to want to have to look at Gerald and Sheila elsewhere in the play. Again, this is taken straight from the SEA mark scheme. It's just a basis. So I would be pointing out that during her own confession, Sheila turns on Gerald when she feels he has judged her, indicating a lack of understanding between them. After her confession, she calls Gerald a fool and warns him not to lie to the inspector, indicating that there is this tension between the two, possibly because they are only marrying to appease her mother and father. And it's also interesting to note that Lord and Lady Croft are absent from the dinner party as well, and that this indicates that they are not pleased because Gerald is marrying beneath him in terms of status. So that's quite important as well, because it furthers our understanding of the question and further meets this idea that Priestley does present marriage as very closely tied to status. Then if we also look at the fact that she is determined to stay and hear Gerald's confession, so there's an area of her fiance's life of which she knows nothing and is becoming aware of this. Also think about the fact that Gerald has an affair with Eva or Daisy, but Daisy is very aware of the fact that it cannot go anywhere. He kind of even suggests that, she knew it couldn't last, and that it had to come to an end because people of the lower status, lower classes, working classes, cannot marry members of the aristocracy like Mr. Gerald Croft. He could marry a member of the middle class like Sheila, but definitely not the Eva Smiths or Daisy Rentons of the world. We can also see that he admits lying to Sheila and is honest about seeing Eva. Sheila respects his honesty but is visibly hurt by the admission of his affair with Eva. Again, that also suggests, the very fact that he is unfaithful suggests that this is a marriage of convenience rather than a marriage for the sake of love. Then if we also look at the fact that she recognises that her and Gerald do not know each other well enough and gives him back the engagement ring, and the prop there is used to emphasise the fact that their engagement is purely a social strategy put in place. The fact that it's such an ostentatious ring and that she says, "Oh, look, mummy, isn't it wonderful?" And then she has to give it back. It symbolises that there's not really much love behind their marriage, that it was just one that was for financial or social gain. Then if you also think about the fact that in the aftermath of the inspector's visit, she defers any decision about marrying Gerald. She has become more mature and a changed person, aware of her responsibilities. Responsibilities that she has to others as well as herself. Whereas Gerald is still more concerned about re-establishing a socially advantageous alliance. And there's that moment when he's just like, well, how about it? And Burling is very eager for his daughter to say yes because of how it impacts him. You might also want to look at Eric's supposed offer to marry Eva or Daisy, and the social discrepancy between Mr. and Mrs. Burling. So the fact that Mr. Burling is of a lower status than his wife, and that obviously for him was an advantageous marriage and helped him get to where he is today, whereas for her, she was marrying beneath her, and that's why she's so snobby and so self-righteous. It's also interesting to note that Mrs. Burling is very adamant that despite the fact that the young man that got Eva or Daisy pregnant, that he should be forced to marry beneath his station. So for her, class is tied to marriage, that moving up the social scale is definitely one of those motivations, and that for that young man to marry beneath him would be some sort of form of humiliation. It's also interesting to note that Eva refuses that, so she's aware that they cannot be together as well, that it's impractical for him to marry beneath him. So these are the kinds of things that you should be jotting down and noting if a question like this were to come up. You're lucky in that you have the blank text in with you, but it has to be a clean copy, and that for the theme question, if you choose to do so, you will be given an extract to focus on. Just make sure that you don't write entirely about it, that you look at the section that you've been told to, analyse it in detail, and that you also then devote another half of it to the rest of the play and how that can actually map onto your question. You can answer that as well, in the same way that I have tried to demonstrate for you in this video.